Thank you, Aaron. I just want to thank the University of Toronto for kind of the invitation to be here today. I'd like to start by just kind of taking a poll. How many people, by a show of hands, think shared mobility is going to solve historic equity issues in transportation? A few people. Okay. So I am here. I'm going to dispel that myth. So one of the key points that I do want to cover today is we heard yesterday a lot about kind of historic inequities related to the automobile. Not disputing that history at all, and in fact, I think it's very fair to say, we talked about Robert Moses yesterday. Robert Moses was racist. But I also think that we need to talk about, really some tough issues on digital discrimination and some other issues going on with respect to shared mobility. So as I talk today, I kind of want to start with this figure today. And you may have seen this before, but kind of looking at, equity in transportation from this perspective, either giving folks what it means to give folks equal options, which is really on the left, what we're doing today with shared mobility. We're giving everybody options that not necessarily accessible to everybody, kind of leveling kind of the playing field or taking barriers away. And so I'm going to be kind of coming back to these themes throughout this morning. So this is just kind of a figure, and I'm going to kind of explain this, but just kind of shows the vast majority of equity issues. And there's a lot more in the shared mobility space than even with the automobile. Everything from issues of banking access, issues of I don't have a smartphone, issues of I can't access a service because it's not in my language, and I'm going to kind of come back to that as well. So this here just kind of summarizes some of these many issues here. I can't afford it, I can't pay for it, I can't access it, whether it be physically or digitally, a variety of impacts for people with disabilities. I really just kind of want to emphasize that in many cases, shared mobility is actually, in some cases, creating obstacles for people. And I think this image up here kind of really highlights just how important it is, not only that we make services accessible physically, but digitally, and also train other people through education outreach that the decisions that they engage in, that can also impact access and equity for others, such as where you park, micromobility. And this is in contrast here. You can kind of see this is a recent picture from Tel Aviv, just kind of showing how some cities are kind of responding to some of those challenges through the use of like docking stations for scooters. So here is just kind of a table, and I apologize, I thought the screen was going to be a little bit larger than this, but I'll kind of summarize this for you real easily. This is just kind of a table showing the demographics of shared mobility users, and in general, we see that they are more upper income, less diverse, higher levels of educational attainment in most cases. There are a few exceptions to that, but we generally know this. And we also know that with certain modes, those inequities are a little bit greater. So one of the things that I think is really important to come back to is the role of the built environment. This is a figure that we've developed, a typology for the U.S. Department of Transportation, just kind of highlighting what we think are 5 common built environments in the developed world, predominantly in North America, from city center, suburban, edge city, exurban, and rural. And what's really important to remember here is that each of these built environments have tailored solutions that we can apply to overcome equity issues, but they also have their own equity challenges as well. And so I'm going to come back to that. So one of the things that we've developed for the U.S. Department of Transportation is we call the STEPS framework to equity, really looking at equity from a kind of 5-point framework, looking at kind of spatial challenges, temporal challenges, economic, physical challenges, and social challenges to accessing transportation. And so there are going to be challenges for each of those, but also solutions as well. So kind of on the spatial side, how do we get to our destination? I think it's really important that we start talking about complete trips, particularly for those with people with disabilities, that we can no longer think about just as one mode accessible, but is the entire trip accessible door to door? And I think that's something we really have to keep bringing back to this conversation. There was a gentleman that is a New York resident in a wheelchair that actually tried doing a trip using a variety of modes on Google Maps and on various apps. And it took 2 to 3 hours for him to get from Manhattan all the way to Brooklyn. And he got all the way to his destination, and he couldn't get there because the curb wasn't accessible at the final 10 feet of his destination. And so I think it's really important that when we start talking about that, a lot of these equity issues blend together, and so they become a spatial, but it becomes a physical as well. A lot of time-based challenges. Late night transportation, we really haven't talked about at all in the workshop yet. Economic issues, we've talked a lot about kind of affordability and kind of subsidies and some areas for that. I'm going to go through this kind of fast because I got a lot of slides I want to get to. Physical challenges. We've talked a lot about physical accessibility, but we haven't talked any about in terms of policies that we can use to address this. And micromobility really is not accessible, and in fact, where there have been some attempts at making it accessible, it's been rather limited. And so I'm hoping in the questions that we can kind of talk a little bit about that. Also, digital accessibility. We haven't really talked about that, but most of these apps are not accessible for people with disabilities for a variety of either visual or auditory disabilities. And so these, again, are some of the equity challenges that we're seeing with shared mobility and increasingly with mobility as a service. We have talked a lot about kind of some of the social challenges, language barriers, things like that. So what are we seeing in the industry to overcome some of these challenges? Well, our team is the independent evaluator for the US DOT Mobility On Demand Sandbox, which is 11 grant programs as part of the Federal Transit Administration to test mobility pilots ranging from app-based services to paratransit services to first and last mile connections. We're seeing a lot of operators partnering to overcome kind of those first and last mile gaps. We're seeing both intentional transit enhancement and transit replacement. Yes, transit replacement can be targeted and appropriate in some cases, and I'm going to explain that. Late night transportation, paratransit, and other types of partnerships. So this is a table here that just kind of summarizes kind of our impact studies that we've conducted over Berkeley on a variety of shared modes. And in general, all of these studies, with a few exceptions, show that shared modes are taking people out of driving, out of public transportation, and out of taxis. Almost across the board. And so what that means is that we need to understand these impacts. There are some local variations, often by built environment, but we need to understand these impacts and we can target solutions for them. So for example, if we know a service is competing with public transportation, then maybe we want to use that either at a time when public transportation service is very limited, such as overnight, or maybe we want to use it in a region that is at capacity and take people off public transit intentionally. So there are some ways to leverage even what can be characterized as some adverse impacts. This is kind of an interesting table here that shows the vast number of growing studies of the impacts of shared mobility and in particular TNCs on other modes. And again, all of these studies almost say the same thing. We're taking people out of taxis, out of public transportation, and again, out of driving. Now, one of the things that we haven't talked about is really the impact of equity in for-hire services, both taxis and TNCs. And I think it's really important that we acknowledge that there's a lot of discrimination going on with for-hire services. It's not just limited to to taxis. It's not just limited to TNCs, but there's a lot of behavioral discrimination going on. People that don't want to serve either low-income communities, they see a name of somebody that they may not identify with ethnically or racially, and so they cancel a ride. Drivers that take women around in longer trips. These are fairly well documented in a number of emerging studies. It's also, I think, important to remember that this picture from New York City just kind of highlights this, that there are a lot of comparable neighborhoods in terms of built environment and density, but they have dramatically different levels of service. So if we were to go to two different similar neighborhoods in New York City from a built environment perspective, but very different from either a racial or economic perspective, and you try to get a service, whether it be a TNC or a dockless or docked micromobility, you might not find the service, your wait time might not be the same. So it's really important that we start talking about and focusing policies that make sure that we've got the same transportation modes available in comparable built environments, same hours and frequency of operation, and comparable wait times. And we really have not been able to kind of address this because of, I think, the lack of regulation and policy in this space. So these are kind of some key kind of policy questions that we see that are emerging. But I really just kind of, I think first and foremost, just want to emphasize the real need for proactive policy to making sure that all of our services are accessible for all. And as we start going into more app-based integrated mobility, we need to be cautious that we're not creating a new digital discrimination. Because I hear a lot of public agencies, and we talked about it earlier this morning, wanting to get out of the cash payment business, wanting to get out of the paper ticket business, and what that means for communities that maybe are low income, immigrant, and others who don't have access to those services. So what I wanted to do is kind of share just a kind of a few resources here. This is some primers that we put together for the US DOT as well as the American Planning Association. This one focuses on equity. We have others kind of available on our website on innovativemobility.org. And I've included kind of my contact information here. I'll reserve the rest of the time for the panel questions. Thank you. Yeah.
Maybe a couple questions.
Yeah. You want to? We can take a few questions. Any questions?
And it was very interesting. I know that the MOD sandbox projects, there's a great concern within the FTA about geographic distribution, equality, I guess, of offering of services. And some places have tried to build those into the RFPs when they partner with other mobility services. Since you've looked at this in great detail, how well do those work?
So I think it's important to remember that the MOD sandbox evaluation is currently ongoing, so it's not complete yet. In terms of geographic distribution, so I actually am going to, I think, disagree a little bit in some of the comments that have been made in terms of spatial equity. We know from the built environment that there are poor low-income communities in urban centers and in urban and ex-urban centers. So I don't think it's a one-size-fits-all. Because the results aren't public yet, I can't get into specifics with the sandbox, but what I will say that there are some emerging lessons learned that we do know from it. We know that access for people with disabilities is a really big challenge, even in the sandbox. We know that there's some institutional policies that are also problematic in the U.S., specific to the U.S. So, for example, drug and alcohol testing is a requirement, and so there are some waivers in place, but there's some real questions that once those waivers expire, if some of these partnerships will even be allowed to occur. Because in order for a user to be able to use a private mobility service provider that doesn't have alcohol and drug testing, such as a TNC driver potentially, you would have to be able to have a suite of choices you can choose from. So the other thing that I didn't kind of talk about either has to do with data. We know that this is probably one of the biggest challenges in the MOD sandbox is negotiation with data, but also what happens to it when and if it becomes public. My personal opinion is that we have not even begun to discuss all of the data issues and the data equity issues in terms of how data is used, who it is sold to, and kind of the monetary value of the data. And most importantly, how do we protect vulnerable communities with data? And there are vulnerable communities that we haven't talked about with data. For example, victims of domestic violence. What happens if their data is scraped and used or obtained from the public sector, and then their data is exposed? So I think, as we kind of talk, I'm hoping in the afternoon we get into some of I think there's breakouts in the afternoon, that we'll be able to kind of hit on some of the data issues and kind of the vulnerabilities that has on populations as well. Thanks.
Our last speaker, and I think we're going to start lunch a little bit later, am I right?